Hello and welcome to episode 4 of The Wine List, which I hope you remember is a podcast for those of us who like a glass of wine but have at times been rather intimidated when faced with a wine list in a restaurant, or indeed being asked, what kind of wine do you like? I'm playing that part, and playing the part of the gentleman who's going to navigate through all the complexities of knowing about wine is my very well qualified friend of 30 years, Mr. Richard Lane. Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Oliver Turnbull.
Are you okay, my fine fellow?
All good, all. Very excited. Episode 4. We're cracking along nicely. Every ep slightly different. And as just repeated, it's not a wine course, this, but there's a little bit of education going on, building your knowledge up all ep by ep.
It's helping already, you know. I got a wine list at the weekend and I perused it. I knew maybe a third of the wines from the conversations we've had. And I was able to make, I think, what was an informed choice. And it was quite decent in the end, and kind of went with the food, so I was quite pleased. So we'll come to the name of this episode in a minute, but there were some things that we talked about in episode 3. You gave me a bit of homework, didn't you?
Well, I did, Ol, and I detected slightly that you were a bit concerned about the concept of aging. I assume you meant aging of wine rather than our middle-aged, middle-class male aging. That we're flourishing. We're in our 50s. We're absolutely on top form. We can't cover wine aging right now because it's a big topic. It's a complex topic. But what was your main concern?
I was trying to work out whether, when people talk about wines and they talk about a 94 or a 2001 or whatever, there's a sort of implication that the older the better. And I'm assuming that that's within limits and within wines. In other words, there's a limit to how good a wine will get the more you age it, and there also is constraints as to which wines you would lay down in order to take advantage of that aging. So it was those two factors that they're not exactly in conflict, but I didn't quite understand how they coexist together.
Yeah. And again, you've just sort of neatly underlined the complexity of the topic. I think I'm going to sort of duck it slightly and say that the vast majority of wines are not intended for aging. They're not going to get better from aging. A lot of wines hold, so they'll stay good for often maybe 3 or 4 years or something. Maybe like that Côte d'Rône last time, it was absolutely fine. It hadn't improved in 4 years. I'm sure it would have been exactly the same. It was lovely and simple and fresh, if you remember, and lovely red fruit. So holding is one thing, but actually improving as a result of bottle aging is pretty rare. For wines to be able to do that, they've got to be of fabulous quality. You just very briefly, you need a couple of essential components. You need really ripe, concentrated fruit. So the quality of the fruit, the grapes, the viticulture has produced just amazing fruit. You also need, generally, a decent amount of acidity, because acidity acts as a preservative to help wines age. And in red wines, tannins that you get from the skins, and we'll cover this in our winemaking ep, red wines have tannins because you have contact with the skins during the winemaking process in red wines, whereas generally you don't with white wines. But in red wines, those tannins, those things that can be really aggressive and dry your gums out when the wines are young, can actually really soften with aging, with time, actually. And so as a result of aging to do with kind of fresh fruits in red wines becoming slightly sort of more dried fruits, more complex, combined with high acidity and the softening of tannins, you can get amazing wines that evolve over time, 10, 20, 30 years. But in the grand scheme of things, those wines are very much in the minority. The majority of wines are for pretty much everyday drinking.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things in there, a lot of things to it. We'll come back to tannin like you say. I'm just starting to be aware of that.
And just a little bit of feedback from EP 3. People asking, loving the wines, but we're not talking about food much. And of course, these days, wine isn't really discussed. I mean, we mentioned food very briefly, of course. We're talking about a wine list. We're in a restaurant. We're going to be eating, aren't we, when choosing our wines from our wine list. I deliberately wanted us and want us to focus on the business of wines, not at the exclusion of food. And food we will certainly introduce in terms of food pairing and food matching as this series progresses. And we're going to have a real bumper ep later on in the series where we're going to really examine food matching and food pairing. But I don't want us to get hung up like the English, particularly the British, seem to be at the moment about constantly pairing food and wine. I want us to really get to understand, for you to get to understand, the nuts and bolts of the business of wine. So let's crack on with episode 4.
Got it. Yeah, okay, you're quite right. I have this chart which shows which wines go with which, and I find it a little bit restricting, really. And I'm sure
It's a
there's an
bit
element
dull
of personal
sometimes
taste.
as
And
well.
it's also a bit tedious.
It's a bit dull, and
Waffling.
it's just part of this slightly quote perfect society that we all live in now, where we're supposed to have the answer to everything, and we can look it up on our phones, and it's just like there's a solution just everywhere for every kind of a scenario. That just isn't. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy it. Crack on. Be creative.
I love it. That's a very sort of French way of thinking, which I actually quite like. I mean, logical Anglo-Saxon. I'm pulled towards rules and give me a spreadsheet which tells me which wine. But you are absolutely right. The artist in you, and you have a scientific and artistic part of you, particularly you, which is a lovely balance. But the artist in you is you're quite right. Say what feels good. Right, episode 4. Do you want to reveal the name of the episode and why?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, every episode from now on has to relate to music, so I can get my violin out at some point.
Oh, the violin's coming out. Splendid.
This episode is about wine history. Episode 4, Wine History, is entitled Georgia on My Mind.
And that's probably not the only musical interlude that we'll hear on this. Georgia on My Mind. Right, beautiful pun, beautiful song. We'll talk about the significance of Georgia in a sec, but I suppose we should mention the wines that we're going to be tasting tonight fairly soon as well.
Absolutely. I want to introduce the wines and also our kind of prop, our guide for this episode. Let's talk about the wines first. We're tasting 2 wines, not the mighty 4 that we had last time. And we are also going to be tasting our red wine as our number 1 wine, our first wine, and later on our white wine. All our wines in the Wine List podcast come from the Wine Society. We are tasting 2 wines, as I said. Both are from 2019, so they're pretty young. We're tasting a Greek red wine called, the grape variety is called Gino Mavro. Quite a trendy grape from northern Greece. This links into, obviously, to our history. And it's made by a producer called Timiopoulos, who's a top producer in Greece and doing very well for himself. £11.50, 13% alcohol. And later on, we'll be tasting a Riesling from Germany. It's called a Spätlese. We'll explain that later on. So it's a medium sweet Riesling, quite north, actually, in Germany. It's just crossing the 50 degrees, help, line. Again, linked to history, because Riesling is very historic, as of course is Greece and Greek culture and wine, because we're talking about history in this week's ep, and very much a guide is the flamboyant wine critic and bon vivant, Mr. Oz Clarke. I met him once, and he is quite flamboyant. He's a terrific writer, but the books that is guiding us during this ep is his recentish book, which is called The History of Wine in 100 Bottles. So I want to say straight away, I am no wine historian. I'm not a historian at all, really, but a lot of the ideas and things we're discussing are linked directly from Oz Clarke's book, so I want to reference that, and I do recommend people read it. It's a fabulous read, and it's very funny as well.
Lovely. I love the label, by the way. The label on the Greek. It's really nice, sort of oldie worldy, slightly faded, and sort of old-fashioned print, fonts all over the place, and some handwritten stuff as well. It's very, very nice. Very sort of Greek and casual. And the German is very sort of very, very, very German, very exact, precise, neat. And again, equally pleasant on the eye. I've got both my wines poured out now. Rich, I'm ready to go. Good name check of Oz Clarke. Sounds like a great book. I haven't read it yet because I'm learning everything from you at the moment.
Exactly.
So where did it all begin?
Well, this is the big question, and this is what Mr. Clarke discusses early on in his book. The point is, we don't know when...
All right, good night. Thank you.
See you for episode 5. Cheers, all. I mean, let's put it another way. Grapes have been growing far, far longer than wine culture, human wine culture has existed. Let's say 6,000 BC, possibly 8,000 years ago, there is some evidence that there was some kind of wine culture going on in the area that is now around the area of sort of northern Iran, Azerbaijan, eastern Turkey, and Georgia.
Ah, I get it.
Yeah. In Georgia, there was a society there, a kind of culture of wine festivals. And, you know, again, history proves it. They came up with this word called vin, G-V-I-N. Huh? So that word obviously predates all the stuff that followed from the Greeks and the Romans and everything else. So I think it's a reasonable assumption to say that actually I think it was probably the guys in Georgia and the Caucasus and, you know, sort of southwest Russia sort of area that got this whole wine gig on the road, possibly as long ago as 1,000 years ago. Wow.
When we say this wine gig, as you call it, it's more than just squishing juice and realizing there's delicious liquid in there. I suppose that you're inferring that there is some kind of fermentation, and therefore there is some kind of alcohol, therefore there is some kind of pleasant feeling that you get apart from the taste. Is that what we're saying, or are we just saying Ribena, effectively?
Oh, no, absolutely. We are talking about the process by which juice from grapes becomes alcohol. And it's important to remember that even though it wasn't until the 1860s when Louis Pasteur actually chemically documented the formulae that goes on here, even way back thousands of years ago, if you have grapes, let's say you get a load of grapes and you store them or you want to keep them, there are naturally occurring yeasts that sit on the skins of grapes. If those grape skins split, then fermentation is going to start straight away. The yeast, because the process of fermentation is yeast consume the sugar in the juice and they convert that sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide and heat. That is basically what fermentation is. And that can happen completely spontaneously. And I would say there's a pretty good bet that people didn't sit around one day saying, let's, because they probably didn't know what yeast was. They certainly didn't know what fermentation was. I suspect it all happened by one lovely happy accident. And people suddenly found, those grapes I put away in a jug, what's happened to them? Something seems to have happened to them. Oh, golly, what a funny smell. And I mean, one mythical thing says apparently there was some figure, I think it might have been a woman, who was so fed up with her lot and her husband and all his wives that she decided to try and take her own life by sipping what she presumed was going to be poisoned, what had happened to these grapes. And she ended up having a wild old time and feeling rejuvenated. Of course, this is all folklore, this sort of thing. But you can see how, it came along. And going back to the Georgians, I mean, they did actually have a Gavin festival, in October, i.e. the time at which the grapes would be ripe. So clearly something was going on. Yeah, Georgia is definitely on my mind.
Just quickly, going back to the old requirement for yeast and it potentially occurring naturally. Presumably, the process of making wine these days, you have to inject the yeast artificially and under great control rather than just hoping that there's yeast available on the skins, right?
Well, yes. Again, great question. I mean, that's how the safest fermentations go on now. But there's very much a trending natural wine movement at the moment. And because yeasts, as I said, they occur naturally, even in modern day wineries, you'll find yeast on the surface of grapes. Some producers actually want to use wild yeast rather than kind of cultured yeasts, and some wine is made that way. Often it's a bit of a compromise. You can start the fermentation process off using the natural yeasts on the skins of the grapes, and then you buy in some kind of clinical yeast to finish it off.
Right. I quite like that idea. It's funny, isn't it? It's like, hey, tell you what, so this thing that's delicious, why don't we try and make it the way they did it 2,000 years ago? Well, no, because there's been 2,000 years of R&D since then. But I'm sure it's not as simple as that, and there are some advantages of it's like people who say, I'm going to make this canoe was made in the way that the prehistoric people used to make canoes, and I'll have that fiberglass one, please, to go down this roaring river. Anywho,
fantastic. And it's not such a big leap, actually, Olv, and I think we should actually, let's do it now. I think we've got to remember, we are improving your palate, hopefully, through each ep. It's not a huge leap from the Georgians to the Greeks. I mean, we're skipping over Phoenicians slightly and the Egyptians. By the time the Greek civilization came along, we're sort of talking 4th century BC. This is when wine culture really started to develop. And I think, let's just pause for a second, because I want you to have a little sip of the first wine.
Right, I'm going to do it. So it's the red. As I poured it a few minutes ago, you might have heard actually, it's that lovely, well, it's a red wine obviously, but it's a lovely red colour, as in sort of classic red. Quite pale, so not like.
I was going to ask you, Ol, if it's pale, because Gino Mavro is a paler colour, so I am told. Would you say, is it paler than the Côte d'Aron last week?
Yeah. Oh, no, definitely, and redder. It's that lovely red colour that I really like. So that's rather nice. I'm going to do my old swirling, which I'm getting better at.
Yeah, good man.
Wow. It smells very different to the Côte d'Aron.
Yes. I want. This is, again, another reason why chose this wine off because it's again a bit like that Cabernet Franc. It's quite aromatic.
Oh, it really is. I like it.
Isn't it lovely?
It really nice, really different. It smells of a different fruit.
Could you describe what you're smelling just on the nose before we taste it?
Ooh, do I want to say red fruit? It's very,
Yes.
very distinctive. Oh, I've got it. Have I got it?
Yeah, it's red fruit. It's definitely red fruit. And also the aromatics. I'm getting something floral here.
Yes, definitely.
I'm getting something. You get something sort of. I'm no expert on flowers and stuff, but I'm getting something slightly violety and slightly rose petally.
Rose petally is there. I want to say pansy, but that's because it's a funny word.
It smells of the old flower bed. This wine.
Right, now you said flower bed then, and that's exactly what I was thinking was a mixture. Like we got these lovely flower pots outside. When you bung your nose in there's no particular flower dominating.
Yeah.
It's just a lovely floral.
It's a
note.
floral
Really
thing.
nice.
It's a generic floral thing.
Oh, well done. This is really nice, actually. Lovely smell. I haven't sipped it yet. I suppose I should.
No, let's go for it. Let's sip together. Remember, got your spittoon, and remember to spit. No spluttering this week, please.
No, I actually swallowed. It tastes like it smells, which is not surprising. It's nice and it's not heavy. It feels like a wine you could have outside in the sun. Maybe I'm just thinking of Greece and it's auto-suggestion. But it feels like that. It has that vibe to it rather than sort of a heavy dinner wine that you'd have with red meat.
Spot on, all. And it's lovely. I mean, the Wine Society say it's medium-bodied.
really
I think it's almost a bit less than medium-bodied. It is quite light. It hasn't got that sort of weight in the mouth that the Gigondas had last time. Absolutely not.
No, and I can find that slightly somnolent. Is there some kind of herb going on?
Well, let's just rattle through it. Just to summarise, you've said it's kind of pale. Did you say it's pale ruby colour?
Yes, that's right. I want to say, your classic red.
It's dry. How's the old dribbleometer?
Dribble on me. I thought you were going to say, how's the, how long does it last? I can't remember what the word is for that. And I was going to have an answer for that.
Finish. We'll do that in a minute.
Bit of saliva, not too much.
It's sort of not quite really high acidity, but it's on the way there. It's sort of medium plus acidity. It's 13% alcohol, which is slap bang in the middle of the alcohol range for dry wines. Before we get to the finish, I want to ask you about tannins. Are you getting any coating on your tongue and your
my
teeth?
God. Right. I will be gutted if I get this wrong, but I am.
Good.
I am getting it, and I had never experienced it before. Not really until now. You've asked me about it before, and I was a bit vague, but I am absolutely getting it. It's almost like a tightness in my mouth. Could I describe it that way?
Yeah, because it's a texture. Tannin's not a flavour. Tannin is a texture. Take another sip, Ol, and you don't need to drink it. Remember, you've got your spittoon. And really rinse it around your teeth and your gums. Wow, I can really feel it on my gums. But it's lovely because it's a texture. It's a characteristic of the wine, along with the red fruit, the herbs. It's definitely things like red cherries, red plum. I'd say dried herbs. Really lovely. And really lovely tannins, quite high levels of tannins, but they're not great big thick tannins that are blasting you. They're kind of rather fine. I know this is a bit geeky, but and I've done diplomas and wine exams and stuff, but they've got a lovely sort of fineness to the tannins. It's part of the character of the wine. And what about the finish, Ol? Have another sip and tell me how long the fruit and the herby flavours last once you've spat it out.
Ages. They're lasting a long time, and I'm getting. It's almost like it's almost like the subtle flavours are being stripped away, and I'm left with that initial taste / smell that I first got hit with, which I like. It seems to go on for quite a while. It's still there, actually. Still there from my last glug, and my last glug gave me a tannin. What's the word? A tannikit. I like the way you said tannin is a texture. It's like the second verse of Rhythm is a Dancer for wine buffs. No, I get it. There's something happening in my mouth, which is not a taste. It's a feeling, which is it's not unpleasant. It's just a thing.
Again, this is another reason why tasting wine and getting to understand wine is interesting, because it's not just about what it looks like, what it tastes like. It's about what it smells like. It's about the weight of it in your mouth. And if it's a red wine, what character do these tannins have, and if, of course, if the wine is out of balance and the tannins are too high, not good. Going back to what we were saying tiny bit about aging, if wines have very aggressive tannins when they're very young, then they should soften over sort of 2, 3, 5 years. The only problem is if you haven't got the fruit concentration at the beginning, by the time the tannins have softened, the fruit's gone, and then you end up with a bit of a dull old wine. It was the Greeks, so sort of 4th century BC, that sort of time, who took wine and it became part, in a very democratic way, because democracy is a Greek word, isn't it? But
Yeah.
wine became part of everyday life. I don't think they were big drinkers. Certainly, it was all, the wine culture was part of the food culture and philosophy and art, and it's all part of that Greek civilization thing. The main issues were there were no bottles. Wine was basically stored in clay pots, these amphorae that I've mentioned. And also, Ollie, the big problem, and this applies to Romans and any early winemaking, they couldn't put stoppers on the wine. So this is a huge, huge issue. So if you can't protect wine from oxygen, it's going to turn to vinegar.
It's one of those small things that you don't really think about. Of course, you can put stoppers in wines. Why couldn't you use a cork stopper? Oh, we hadn't thought of that. It's a little bit like Napoleon's army's problems in the Russian winter when they had the wrong isotope of tin on their uniforms and the tin crumbled in the temperatures. And you'd have thought not having buttons would be just a sort of peripheral issue. But of course, when you can't do your jacket up,
it's minus 40. That's a bit of a problem.
It sort of feels like one of those things, just this tiny thing, crumbling tin versus not having cork. So no concept of aging. It's funny, I want to go back to something you said about the philosophy, the culture, the way of living and stuff. And the fact that alcohol, let's not sidestep the point that alcohol can change your perception. It can give you a high. It can make you drunk if you drink too much. Do you think, is your theory part of it, that lovely warm feeling you get from the first glass of wine, maybe even the second? Obviously, we're not advocating going any further than that. You get that lovely warm feeling and your mind is relaxed. And is that part, do you think, or do we fancy that the Greek society was a gentle, democratic, philosophical society, and that sort of added to it, that feeling of well-being you get from the alcohol in wine?
I think you've just said it all. I mean, let's not be coy about this. Clearly, human beings, quickly realised what alcohol could do, what wine could do, and we've all know what it's like when you have too much wine. It can make you feel really awful, and that's obviously not what we're advocating. But clearly, a sense of well-being from moderate wine consumption, absolutely. And as I said, as far as we can tell, the Greeks just saw it in a way that, perhaps the Italians or the French do today. They see sort of moderate wine consumption as just part of their daily lives. A glass of wine, possibly two max, with their evening meal is what it's all about. And if it means they're more relaxed or they're more convivial, it can bring friends together, it can promote discussion, open people up to talk about politics and art and all those other cultural aspects. Yeah, wine's absolutely part of that. It's a little bit of a catalyst, I suppose, getting things going.
Yeah, what I found as I've matured is that alcohol's almost like a blessing if used obviously really with care and in moderation, and obviously you don't use it every night or whatever, but it can be just it's a lovely thing to share with your wife or your kids if they're old enough, your friends.
And friends.
Opening a bottle of wine and having a chat and just relaxing. It's a lovely, lovely thing. I sometimes think that our Italian friends, our French friends, our Spanish friends, our Greek friends maybe, have sort of got this slightly better than we have in their cultures. Maybe we're catching up.
But if you're producing billions of bottles of the stuff, which almost the French, Italians and Spanish are, it's just part of your culture and you grow up with it.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, that was delicious. I'm really surprised by that Greek wine.
Tell you what I'd like to have with this Greek, I'd like to have a pizza with this wine. Wouldn't it be delicious with olives and kind of cheese it would be so good with anchovies, a nice acidity. Maybe. Anchovies, it would be wonderful.
Mushrooms, yeah.
Mushrooms, yeah.
Goodness, yes. I can just see it. Very good. You could put that suggestion in my mind. I was almost thinking of a meaty fish, and I thought that was going to be slightly iconoclastic, given it to be a red wine.
A red wine with fish. But hey, I'm up for that. And particularly because this has a light feel to it and the acidity is lovely, but I think it'd be brilliant at cutting through cheese, sliced meats, that sort of thing. Really delicious. I think the main thing, just to move things on maybe a couple of centuries, is obviously to mention the Roman Empire, which sort of subsumed the Greek Empire. So we're sort of, talking sort of first century BC right up to sort of, well, whenever it dissolved. Someone's going to correct me now, but it's sort of 4th, 5th century AD. This was the huge growth because obviously the Romans did lots of things, invaded lots of countries, built roads and dams and waterways and civilized huge parts of Europe.
It's a magnificent summary. Romans did things.
They did things, yeah. That's it. That's how qualified I am. Romans did things.
No, but it's absolutely accurate. 100%.
They did so much because they invaded so much. They conquered so much. If you look at the places now, today, 21st century, in Europe, where most of the wine and famous wine regions are, places like, obviously, southern France, Italy, obviously, parts of Spain, even up into Germany. So places like the Mosel, where we're going later on with our white wine, and the Rheingau, the Rhine River. Huge kind of concentration of vineyards there for many, many centuries because the Romans were there 2,000 years ago. So the legacy of what the Romans were doing in terms of carving new passages, invading and laying down vineyards and to make wine exists today. So basically the European wine map is not hugely dissimilar to how it would have been when the Romans got going 2,000 years ago.
And of course, the 3050 has been immovable since the Earth was formed, and of course, a lot of their doing stuff was in the 3050 stripe, I suppose.
Absolutely right. The other factor here is, of course, is that transporting wine was such a nightmare that often you'll find vineyards close to rivers. It meant that grapes could be transported along rivers, and that's why the River Rhine in Germany was so important, and we'll come to that a bit later on.
Yeah, distribution, we'll do that. So that's what the Romans have ever done for us, which it turns out is quite a lot. And then we go to the miserable Dark Ages, which I always assume were just about crap and people waiting around for something to happen, you know.
Yes, there was a bit of a pause for about 600 years. It's just funny. I have looked at some history books, not just Oz Clarke's book, and again, it's this kind of this void of, not what went on after the fall of the Roman Empire until the medieval times, sort of 11, 1200. So really the wine story has to be picked up again around that time. The only thing to say is that people who would have kept wine going in some form during those 600 years or whatever it is of Dark Ages was, of course, the good old church. Wine became, again, a cultural significance, religious significance because of the Eucharist, because of the sacrament.
The sacrament of, yes, exactly.
The blood of Christ in communion, exactly. During the Dark Ages, the only people keeping the wine thing on the road were probably the Benedictine monks, followed later on in 1200s by the Cistercian order, who were a bit more sort of severe, a bit more serious, because apparently the Benedictines like their wine a bit too much. In Burgundy, where we were last week, when you had your map out and we were looking at the Côte d'Or, that beautiful central bit of Burgundy in central eastern France, it was the monks who realised that if they planted their vines and grew their grapes in certain places, some did better than others. And if the vines and the grapes were facing south, southeast, southwest, were protected from the north and the prevailing westerly winds, and they were mid-slope, where the drainage of the soil was quite good, not at the top where they could be blown away by the winds, or on the flat land below, they got the best results. What do you reckon, Al?
Well, I think that might well be the first concept, or people first understanding the concept of terroir.
Terroir. You got it, mate. And of course, you're an expert on terroir after last week's ep.
Yep, soil aspect.
There is a vineyard today called Clos Vougeot. It's a walled vineyard. That's what a clos means. It's 50 hectares. It's huge on the Côte d'Or for red wine, for black grapes, i.e. Pinot Noir. And that's a Grand Cru vineyard that was first mapped out by the monks about 800 years ago. What's next, Dol, on the chronology? I know you've been mapping out a chronology for this ep.
Well, we're in the 15th, 16th century, and then there's a mention of something that happened, something that still exists from 1540, which sounds like it's something that happened with our Teutonic brethren and Visigoths and Ostrogoths. The fact that there seems to be in a museum a Riesling from 1540, which is showing very strong evidence of winemaking in Germany around that time.
Riesling, not Riesling.
Oh God, I've done it again. That's the Spanish, the French, and the Germans.
Yeah, you're getting the full set, mate. It's going to be a full house. Have inappropriate pronunciation. The 1540 thing is just a nice little thing to mention. There is one bottle left of a wine, a Riesling. There's a bottle in someone's cellar in some castle in sort of Würzburg, which is Bavaria sort of area, that has not been opened, but it was made in 1540 and is still in existence. There was another bottle of this wine that was consumed as recently ago as 1960. This famous guy, Hugh Johnson, wine writer, he was lucky enough to taste it. And he said, literally, for a few seconds, it was amazing. It tasted sort of Madeira and figgy and complex and a bit sweet. And then the thing just almost evaporated. It sort of disappeared like some kind of strange elixir just because the wine was so old. The contact with the air and the oxygen suddenly went and had gone. So he just got a tiny kind of glimpse of it before it died. When you think there is a bottle of wine that was made in 1540, sitting in someone's cellar in Germany, 1540, Henry VIII.
I'll have the 1540 Riesling, please.
Yeah. Henry VIII was, still around, and 100 years before Johann Sebastian Bach and all that stuff. Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that is incredible.
Well, I think, we should have a little peep at our Riesling.
Yeah, let's do it. Now, I need to declare here, Rich, that when I grew up, and again, this is part of the snobbery and inverted snobbery and misappropriated snobbery that comes with wine drinking, which is so tedious, but sweet wine was sort of almost considered something that people like us didn't drink. We were always about dry white wine, and that was, I don't know, is it more sophisticated or something like that? I got that vibe when I was young, and I never was exposed to sweet white wine. I've since been exposed to dessert wine, which I really like, but I would never choose actively a sweet white wine because of all those prejudices I hold on from my Yorkshire childhood in the 1970s.
Well, it's interesting, and obviously trends and tastes change all the time. If we were in the mid-19th century and Queen Victoria was on the throne, we would be absolutely all be drinking sweet German wine. Do you remember it was called Hock?
Oh, yeah.
That was the fashion at the time because some of the best wines made were sweet. But then what happened, particularly during the 20th century, is that particularly after World War II, Germany had to rebuild after World War II. Some very, very poor wine was produced that was kind of off dry, medium sweet, lacking in any concentration. Remember Liebfraumilch?
Liebfraumilch? Yeah, when it's a CH at the end is a sh.
That's it. Liebfraumilch and things like that gave Germany a very, very bad rep. So it was kind of easy, and the same with Eastern Europe under the communist era, actually. It was very easy to produce semi-sweet, really pretty awful wine. So sweet wine's rep took a real nosedive. Whereas actually, sweet wines, as you've already said, can be magnificent. Things like Sauternes from Bordeaux or Tokai from Hungary, and some wonderful sweet wines made in so many different ways and so many different styles. Let's just look at our sweet wine hero. This is our second wine tonight. It's a 2019 Riesling from the Moselle, from a producer called Dr. Lucen. There are a lot of doctors in Germany producing wine for some reason. They must be onto something. And
you probably get a doctorate in winemaking. I mean, you can get a doctorate in almost anything in Germany. That's why you have, Herr Doctor, people with 2 doctorates.
That's
they
right.
Stick them together, don't they?
They do. And I mean, first of all, we've both got the bottle. It's the lovely classic, thin, sort of long fluted bottle, isn't it, that you associate with German wine. Riesling is a white variety, and the hallmark characteristic of Riesling is its high acidity. Why do you think the acidity is high in Riesling or in Germany?
Is it anything to do with latitude?
Good boy, you have been listening.
I have been listening, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, of course it is. Alcohol 8.5, goodness me.
Low alcohol. And the reason it's low is because the Moselle is so chilly. I mean, it's over, just a touch over 50 degrees north. If this wine was a dry wine, they would let the yeast consume all the sugar and you'd end up with maybe a 12% dry wine. But the acidity would be really intense.
Got it.
What you do, and what they do traditionally in the Moselle, where the acidity is high because of the cool climate, not always, they do make dry wines, is that they're on the way to making a dry wine, and then they stop the fermentation. They may literally remove the yeast, so the yeast can't carry on eating the sugar. Right. So the wine has to stop its fermentation halfway through. What do you end up with? You end up with some alcohol that the yeast has converted some of the sugar to alcohol, but not all of the sugar to alcohol. And with the yeast filtered out, you're then left with what's called residual sugar in the wine. And that's what we've got here.
Right. So I'm sure it's not as simple as this, but because it's sweet, the sugar's remained and hasn't been eaten by the yeast to make alcohol. So why would we be surprised that it's low alcohol? There's something else I'd like to point out on the label, on the back, Dr. Lucen's label. Very German. It's got like a table, almost like a spreadsheet. I love it. And it says style, fruity, aromatic. And then it says terroir, cool climate, slate soil. And then it says food pairing, modern European cuisine, sushi, fish, white meats, and then social awareness, lightweight bottle, and eco-step wine. Don't know what that means, certified winery. So it's got quite a lot of information about the wine on the back of the bottle, which I really quite like. I like the way that the French like to obscure it a little bit to make it all a little bit more difficult to understand. But Dr. Lewson bungs it all on the back of the label to tell you exactly what you're getting.
Brilliant.
I'm going to taste it now.
Tell me the colour, Ol, then we'll do the nose, then we'll do the palate.
So it's pale yellow. It's very lemony. And it smells very, very different from the wine I smelt last week. I could tell those two apart instantly if I had them both in two different glasses very close to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are you smelling?
Not much. I'll do the swirl. Oh, I'm getting more now. It's almost like I can smell the slate, the slaty soil. The good doctor has told me about.
You do get amazing slate there in the Moselle. You get very steep vineyards overlooking the river there. Steep's good because you get more sun ripening the grapes at that quite northerly latitude. And these slaty soils, they're good. They're good for drainage and they will give a bit of minerality.
Yeah, there's minerality in the smell. It's sort of fresh. It's nice.
It is. It's nice. It's not complicated, is it? To me, it smells like quite concentrated lemon to me. Sort of lemon and sort of lemon curdy and stones.
I'm almost thinking sort of tangerine, but maybe I'm...
Oh, that's all right. Yeah.
Oh, those... what were they called? Those oranges you used to get in cans in syrup. Delicious treat.
Give it a taste.
Wow, that's sweet. That's definitely sweet. Now, can I handle it? As I've been so ill-educated in sweet wine, it's not like the stickiness you get with the dessert wine. It is a sweet wine which I'm having trouble enjoying because of my prejudice, I think. But the taste behind the sugar is really rather lovely and subtle. I should look beyond the sugar, or indeed enjoy the sugar maybe, to the subtle taste. And it does taste not very alcoholic as well, which is quite nice.
Quite pleasant. Are you aware of the high acidity in this wine, Ol?
It feels like it's harder to tell.
Because the sugar, the sweetness is kind of balancing out the high acidity.
Yeah.
Most sweet wines, and especially the ones you mentioned, the really sticky ones, like Sauternes or other sweet wines, they have to have high acidity. Otherwise, your mouth would just be clawing. You wouldn't even be able to drink them. It'd be very tiring to drink. This is clean as a whistle, this wine. Yes, there's certainly quite a bit of what's called in the trade residual sugar as a result of the winemaking I was telling you earlier about them removing the yeast halfway through, leaving some sweetness in the wine. But if you have another sip, sure, there's sweetness there, but it's clean as a whistle. Leaves your mouth very easy. You don't get coated in sweetness.
No, it's not sickly. It's nice, actually.
It's really lovely.
I think I could get used to this. I love its lightness. I hadn't really realised that sweet and acid are not... Sweet and acidity are not opposites of each other. Sweet and dry are opposites of each other.
Correct.
Acidity can come in on a different axis, if you like.
Yes, acidity is all on its own, absolutely. Whereas dryness and sweetness are two ends, polar opposites of one particular scale. Then you've got things like body, and then you've got alcohol and all these tannins, if it's a red wine, all these variables interacting.
I've tasted low alcohol wines before, and they are universally dreadful, but because you feel like what's the point? And also, part of the enjoyment of it is the taste of the alcohol, but this doesn't feel like I'm being shortchanged in the alcohol department. It feels alcoholic, and it feels complete, if you like, as a wine drinking experience. I'm still struggling with the sweetness because I'm not used to it. Because I enjoy dessert wines, I'm starting to appreciate it, and the flavours are lovely. They really are.
What would you imagine eating with this, Ol? Or would you just have it by itself?
Dr. Lewson, what do you suggest? Sushi. Oh, sushi, yes. I see
that would be great.
Yes. Oh, lovely. Sushi would be awesome with this wine. Lovely, yes.
So the umami kind of from the sushi with the high acidity cutting through that as well, but a little bit of, obviously, the sweetness here in the wine. I think that would go really, really well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I'm getting the aftertaste as well is really quite pleasing now. It's like I can tell the sweetness in my mouth is still there, and so the taste. It's nice, really nice actually. It's like when you have a dessert, when you have a pudding, as we'd say up north. The sweetness is lovely, isn't it? You like it, and the sweetness stays on your tongue and in your mouth after you've eaten it. It feels like that. It feels like I've just had a bit of pudding, and I'm still getting a nice aftertaste from it. I'm being won round by this wine. I think every mouthful. And I must get rid of a couple of them. Every mouthful is I'm enjoying it more.
What's next, Ol? Where have we got to? We're in the 16th century, aren't we?
We're in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, and we're starting to overcome the problem you had before, you talked about before, about wines not being easy to transport and therefore it being rather a local thing, to it starting to become, I suppose, a trade thing, something you could make money in, you could actually make into a business. The England, Holland, Portugal trade routes to Britain.
Let's take Bordeaux, for example. By the sort of 16th, 17th century, Bordeaux was very much getting on the map. And obviously people were making money out of wine, and they realised they could make money if they could trade it. And of course, the reason Bordeaux was chosen by the Romans all those years ago was because just north of Bordeaux, that Gironde estuary where the river Dordogne meets the river Garonne, it's just this huge natural kind of harbour, which was just fabulous for boats to sail off to places, so for trade to take place. So no brainer. Got to remember, of course, England was at war with France a lot of the time, and Spain as well a lot of the time. So we were not getting much wine from those countries. But actually our trade route with Portugal was really interesting. We've always had a good relationship with Portugal, and that meant that things like port as a commodity and as a trading wine just became phenomenally successful. It has been for hundreds of years, still is. When it came to things like France, Scotland, who got on well with the French, even though the English didn't get on so well with the French, there was a superb export of good old claret, going back to our favourite claret, from Bordeaux to Scottish ports, but not to English ports. So that was kind of just because of the politics of the day.
I said, did whiskey go the other way as well?
Presumably, I'm sure it did. Just to mention a couple of other really important things as we skip through the centuries and come to the present day. 17th century, two really important things happened: glass and corks. Let's take glass first. And actually, this is what the English were really, really good at, was making very tough glass. And this was really important around the time of Dom Perignon, another monk. It's always the monks, isn't it? He was the guy who, obviously got champagne on the road with the sparkling wine. But the problem was, because of the sparkling going on inside the bottle, that creates pressure. And the French glass was a bit too feeble and used to break.
Excellent.
So it was the strong English glass, as a result of our kind of coal mining in places like the Severn Valley and Newcastle, that actually meant that glass could be blown at much higher temperatures and was much stronger. So although we couldn't make wine or champagne or anything like that, we could damn well make some tough glass.
That's so British. Well, you make something to put it in.
Absolutely right. So that was an important development, as was the kind of emergence of cork, because although cork oak trees have been around forever, it was only around the 17th century when people realised if they cut cork and its spongy bark on the cork tree, they could squeeze it into the top of a bottle where it would naturally expand because it's so spongy. And as a result, it would be watertight and airtight. And that totally began to revolutionise what was possible, because, of course, the main problem was that you couldn't transport wine because wine would go off so quickly.
There are also things that took us back as well. So you're going to tell me about someone who I thought was a bloke called Phyloxera, but he's not a bloke. It's something rather disastrous that happened in the late 19th century.
Oh yeah, Phil. We have to talk about Phylloxera. It was absolutely catastrophic at the time, although probably, like a lot of bad things, led to some good things afterwards. Phylloxera is a little tiny bug. It's called an aphid. It attacks the roots of vines. The weird thing was, it doesn't attack the roots of American vines, because American vines are different to European vines. Someone was interested to know what American vines were like, so they just very innocently brought some over from the New World to Europe, not realising the Phylloxera aphids were sitting on the roots, and they started munching the European vines, which were made slightly differently, and basically a bit like it was a bit like the COVID pandemic of the wine world of the late 19th century.
Awful.
Absolutely decimated the industry. Very few places in the world got away Phylloxera free. Only Chile and a part of Australia got away with it, which meant that, this thriving sort of late 19th century culture that had grown and grown and grown with all the great houses of Bordeaux and all the great merchants and the money and the volume and the trappings of wine and culture, was being decimated because of a tiny little bug that you could hardly see. This led to all sorts of scratching of heads, major global symposium, not helped by other minor things going on like, World War One and stuff. So this was a really, really difficult time. And as a result, the solution was that the roots of the American vine species, which were immune to the Phylloxera aphid, were cultivated and grafted onto all European vines.
No, that's unbelievable.
Bit of a job doing that, a few million vines. What should we do for the next 10 years? Let's just graft some vines.
It'll be okay because in 20 years we might be able to afford to eat.
Yeah.
The Daily Mail would call them Frankenstein grapes. Are they the ones that proliferate around Europe now?
Yeah, absolutely. So the vine,
Good
so
Lord.
most of the vines now, I mean, phylloxera still exists. You still get outbreaks of it from time to time. It's a bit like having the old COVID vaccine. As long as you've got the American rootstock, which the aphids can't attack, and it's then melded to a European vine further up, as in grafted, that's the correct term, isn't it? Grafted. Then you're okay. So you can have your European vines producing their lovely different varieties like Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, and all the things that we love. That they come from the European version of the vine. Good old American rootstocks at their feet, protecting the vine from phylloxera.
That's extraordinary.
And the other important thing, this is the kind of good thing, if you like, about phylloxera, if there is a good moral to this tale, is because phylloxera was so devastating and people took such a hit financially, economically. It meant that once phylloxera had gone away, or that a solution had been found, it led some people very, very keen to make a quick buck, and there were all sorts of naughty, fraudulent wines being produced, things being passed off, saying they were one thing but they weren't.
But people were doing this for survival purposes as well as, not just to be fraudulent, but even so. Unintended consequences.
But the point was, there was no regulation of what was going on. And this led to our favourite friend, appellation contrôlée, which emerged in the 1930s, which basically said, we are going to have to regulate these vines. We're going to have to look at these vines. We're going to tell you the areas where these vines can be grown. And when you make wine from these vines, we need to taste it and examine it and check that it does what it says on the tin. It's not about a measure of quality, it's about a measure of authenticity, saying where it came from is, that it's come from an authentic source. That was appellation contrôlée. That happened in the 1930s. That was a kind of rebound from the devastation of phylloxera.
We got to fast forward, Rich. There's been so much material you've uncovered. We've got to fast forward quickly to the last 50 years, basically our lifetime, because there are some quite unexpected things that were still going on when we were nippers.
Absolutely true. I think the most important thing, and it started happening in the 1960s, that has revolutionised modern winemaking, is hygiene in the winery and the availability of temperature control in the winery, because fermentation is if it's not controlled, it's such a heated exchange, literally, chemical process. If you don't control the temperature during fermentation, you get some really funny odours and flavours, stinky wines. As recently ago as probably the 1990s, 80s, 90s, you could be down in the south of France. You didn't need to go and look at a map to find out where the winery was. You could smell it. It was just such a messy business. But it was the Germans, actually, perhaps no surprise, with their ability to organise, and plus they had to rebuild their country after World War II. They really got hygiene and temperature control inside the wineries going in the 60s, and that has led to the revolution now where today most wines, even if they're not particularly interesting wines, they will be clean, they will be of acceptable quality, there won't be any hygiene problems, the kind of standards, if you like, the health and safety stuff. It sounds boring. It's actually incredibly important. It's not that long ago that people would be saying, the wine's corked, because the cork technology wasn't very good and you get a problem, some chemical reaction. And of course, increasingly people are using screw caps now. On wines like our Riesling today, I was amazed to see that our Riesling's got a screw cap. It's fantastic. And the evidence is, in case anyone's wondering, screw caps are at least as good as corks. We don't need corks. Lovely though it is to withdraw a cork and hit a pop. Screw caps are great. And certainly from this millennium onwards, obviously started by the New World producers, and we're going to talk more New World in next week's epi, or we'll go much more into New World, and the culture there. The screw caps have been a mainstay since the beginning of this millennium, certainly from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and it is increasing.
Very stupid question. Screw caps have been available since before this millennia. What happened to make them acceptable / as good as cork?
People did trials, basically. came up with some evidence. And I love pulling a cork, but sometimes, hey, great, can't find my corkscrew. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's a screw cap.
That's right. I feel exactly the same way. With my lovely new corkscrew, I very much enjoyed opening the Ginevra, but also it's incredibly convenient to unscrew the wine from our German friends. Rich, this has been more than a canter through the history of wine from, well, I think you said 8,000 years ago, and has been wonderful. I've learnt a lot, as always, and two really delicious wines. I just had a sip whilst you were talking of the Riesling. Do you know what? It's really growing on me. I'm going to have a glass tomorrow with my wife. I think she might like it. What's happening next week?
We're going to have a look at the New World. I mean, the New World is almost a bit of an old concept now because, as we will discuss, we're going to be looking at the New World versus the Old World. Do we still need to look at it in those terms? We're going to focus on a bit on Australia particularly, that we haven't really covered yet at all. And we're going to be tasting, dear listeners, get your wines out. The details will be on the website. We're going to be tasting the Wine Society's Shiraz. We're going to be comparing that with the Wine Society's French Syrah. By the way, Syrah and Shiraz, same thing. We're also throwing an Australian white wine in. Again, Wine Society, the Hermit Crab. And it's made from by a producer called Darrenberg. And it's a Viognier Marsanne blend. And that's our white wine. So 3 wines next week. I'll see you then, dear boy.
Sounds good, Rich. Thank you. My God, my head is full. I'm just going to have one last sip of the Riesling and enjoy it very much. And I bid you farewell. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you